Welcome to The Accident. This is a series that examines how people dealing with motor accidents, motor vehicle accidents, survive through the help of many people. We have a special program today called Faith Healing, and it is about how faith, how spiritual intervention is a part of the process of dealing with people who are in traumatic life events. We have today with us 4 people who've had direct experiences dealing with traumatic events in healthcare settings as well as in the community. And I'd like to introduce them right now. Starting with Reverend Tim Hastings from St. Mary's of Michigan. And Tim is also a person who's worked as an EMS diver and has other experiences that are part of his background. Kathy Bond, who is from Covenant Health Care, and Kathy is a spiritual element in the healing process in that healthcare system. Roger Stauffer, who is a Reverend and head of the spiritual health services at Mid-Michigan Health, and Gib Giblin, who is a pastoral care person who works with the Midland Evangelical Free Church and also with the hospitals in the area, and he's also a Reverend. So we'll start over here with Tim, and I wanted to ask Tim if he could provide a little bit of information about how he has seen the experience of spiritual care used or implemented in various settings.
Well, in the hospital, at St. Mary's Hospital, we have a long tradition of spiritual care, going back to 1874 when the original sisters were the nuns, the dishwashers, everything there is to do. So it's been long incorporated there that chaplains are the ones who come and speak about the things besides the needles, besides the other kinds of folk. And so we have crosses on every room, and we are part of the equipment at that place.
So it's really embedded in that healthcare system.
It is,
Yeah.
and I really enjoy having that be that way. So.
Okay. Kathy, you're with Covenant Healthcare, and your experiences with how spiritual care gets intertwined in that system is something we'd like to know more about.
Well, as a level 2 trauma center for adults and for pediatric patients, chaplains are called upon in all of those trauma situations, primarily to support family as they're arriving, often as they've gotten news that a loved one has been involved in an accident. So chaplains serve to support family initially in the shock of hearing the news, offering hospitality as they wait for news. Often the chaplain will serve to bridge the communication between what's happening in the trauma bay and where the family is waiting, so we help get communication back and forth. One example that's common, if the patient is talkative and responsive, sometimes family will say, you know, tell them we're waiting, tell them we love him, you know, it's okay if the car got wrecked, we're just glad he's going to be okay, so communication can flow in both ways.
Yeah. So you provide a very important element to the family as well as a bridge between the staff.
Yes.
Yeah. Roger, at Mid-Michigan Health, I know that you have been involved very much in developing a spiritual care model, in fact, even special spaces for people to be able to work on whatever it is that is necessary for them to come to peace. Can you share a little bit about that?
Well, in the last 12 years at Mid-Michigan Medical, spiritual care had not been a part of the disciplines offered in care for patients, families, and for our staff. And when I arrived there, the goal was, how are we going to develop this program to be a part of the disciplines that we offer for anyone who enters through the doors, whether it be a trauma patient or a patient coming in for surgery. In the last 4 years, or with building that happened at Mid-Michigan, a spiritual care center has been developed and now operative at the center. And that is a place where people can seek refuge from the busyness that they might experience on the hospital floors. Also a place where the staff can find refuge in the difficulties they may face with a trauma or with an incident that may have happened of a death possibly on the floor, or just a place to get away from things, to collect themselves so that they can go back to the floor and be able to provide good quality care for the patients and for the families. As far as what we've developed at Mid-Michigan for spiritual care, I am as chaplain, and I did have a colleague for a while who was, we would be called anytime we had a major trauma come into our facility. Now, Mid-Michigan is not a level 2 or a level 1 trauma at this time, so many times it was to stabilize and then ship on to another facility. But yet, when family arrived, they needed someone. And the staff has come to call upon me as the chaplain to help them to provide care for the family and to also to be assistance to them, because I also have some medical background myself. But it's mainly to be of support. That's the goal, is to help bring some kind of stability in the midst of crisis, because the families and the staff to some extent do get upset about what has now occurred to another human being, and it is traumatizing. But yet they're trained, the staff is trained of how to handle it. But that doesn't mean that the emotions and the spirit cannot be broken in the midst of that trauma. And that's where I then can be of support for them. Okay. And also to liaison with our community clergy. We definitely want, if someone has a member of they're members of a local church and they want their minister to be present, we're going to do everything we can to get them there, to be of support for them, because they're going to be the ones who will continue to provide that care after the hospital stay.
And that might be somebody like Gib, who also works in the community and in the hospital.
Right.
And so you experience not only the patient, but everything around that patient's life.
Right, and the follow-up care. But I think as a pastor, most important thing is to show up. You know, when there's a crisis, it's a time when people need you. They are looking for support, and we're not just separate things. We are integrated in. God created us that way. And the spiritual life is an integral part of that, especially if people are truly believers, they really understand, and they're really seeking after God. It's a huge, huge support for a pastor to show up and be able to help them do that process.
Yeah, in fact, I think there's evidence to support that actually healing is better. Did a PubMed search recently to look at how many articles there are on spiritual healing, and you know, there's a lot of research out there that supports that this does actually lead to better outcomes.
Right, and a good doctor will know that we're there and we're being supportive and we help, and they actually welcome us and look forward to just being there.
Yeah, and I think Roger mentioned something as we went through this about how staff sometimes really need help. Particularly, I think what I've seen from my experience is when staff are working with young children and they die, or they aren't doing well, and they've been throwing themselves into trying to save that life, and then they can't. Many of them are devastated, and you know, it's really a tough place to be for them, because they're dealing with that day in and day out, and then they have a failure, or at least something that doesn't work out, and it can be very tough on them.
Right.
They can crumple.
Yeah.
Now, we had mentioned something about trauma centers. When people come in from motor vehicle accidents to St. Mary's or Covenant, which are two trauma centers in the area, many times they're in pretty bad shape.
Right.
And as you probably know from your experience, things are moving fast, things are clicking along, there's a lot of confusion, and many times people are dealing with really big-time emotions. How does the spiritual element get played out in that, as you see it?
Well, when we get a call for a trauma, it's an overhead page in our hospital, a level 1, level 2 trauma coming in. So we respond to the ER, and many times when the patient first comes in right off the ambulance, family's not present. And then we try to slip in if we can, and if the patient's awake, and ask if there's anything we can do to help them, to offer a prayer, to contact anybody for them. And then as family begins to arrive, then, as has been said, we serve sort of as the liaison to let them know, here's what I see going on, your patient's awake and talking. Can't give medical information, of course, but your patient's awake and talking, or whatever it might be. And then communicate and have prayers with those folk if they're open to that, and let them know that we're there. Sometimes you don't say anything at all, but just being there in physical support, family will say afterwards, we're so glad you were here, even if you don't say anything, but you're there as the presence of.
Yeah, Kathy was going to add to that. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, early in my training as a resident chaplain, I had a staff member that had experienced a crisis, and months later came up to me and said, you were absolutely phenomenal in the ER with me and my family and so forth. And as a student, I couldn't help but ask, because I thought, I don't remember doing a whole lot. So I asked, can you remember what it was that I actually did or said to help me as a student learning to be a chaplain? And she paused. She said, I honestly can't remember except the fact that you were there. She said, I remember exactly where you were standing. You were on my right side as the physician was presenting the family with the news. And I just smiled, and we talk about the ministry of presence in pastoral care. And then when you hear families say that I remembered that you were with us more than anything, that's what I remembered. So that's why I was smiling as Tim was talking about that. It's not so much what we do or what we say, but the fact that we showed up.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that you're probably all willing to consider is this idea that there's some kind of spiritual communication that takes place
Absolutely.
outside of the senses.
Right.
I mean, we're kind of limited to our major senses, but you're working in that, and I just described this to you as this other wavelength that maybe isn't so obvious if you're not tuning into it. And from that, you have maybe different ways of understanding or feeling what's going on. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think as we work with patients and bringing in the spiritual, it brings in many different elements, one of which is perspective. That if someone is a person of faith, there's a long-range perspective. This person, if they do pass away, we will see them again. And that there's strength. God is there for us, and we are not alone. And God is part of our experience. And so there's resources for the family, for the person that their faith can bring to them.
It conveys hope.
Okay.
We all need hope in something. Everybody has hope. Many people, when they come into a hospital, especially in a trauma, the family is focused upon, we hope they will continue to live. But then there comes a point where sometimes you need to help them to look at what happens if they don't live. Where is your hope? And I do believe as chaplains, the majority of us, it's not just a matter of our presence, it's bringing God's presence into this. People know that we represent God, and they look to God to help them. And if we lose it as chaplains in a crisis, such as what they're experiencing, where are they going to find God?
Yeah.
And I had our nursing staff reiterate that, just like Kathy had shared, that we do bring that presence. I have heard that a number of times, especially from our emergency room nurses. They'll tell me, we really appreciate you being there because it reminds us that God does care. And the other side of the coin is that some people, because of a motor vehicle accident and because of this trauma, have a feeling of guilt. Some people feel, what have I done that God did this to me?
Right.
And we're not there to argue with them, but we're there to help journey through that of what makes you feel that God did this to you. Not to tell them, God didn't do this to you.
Right.
That's not what they needed to hear at that moment. They just need to know, and they need to work it through, and we're there to help facilitate that.
Yeah.
And also to provide a calm presence. And that is very important.
Yeah.
'Cause, yeah, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay, spiritual disciplines too. That, they come in and either with a patient or if they're not able to really respond, the family members, praying with them, use of scripture, asking them what their favorite scriptures are, where you can start building that bridge back to God, getting them to focus on God, being able to lean back on Him, where at the moment they're in crisis. I mean, they're shocked, they're numb, whatever. And you need to start bringing them back. And sometimes they do feel very guilty. I remember the person that hit the person out on the highway. And she kept saying, I killed this guy, I killed this guy. And she didn't, but you couldn't argue with her. It was a very, very difficult, time for her. She did nothing wrong. And a man died. And that takes time. The immediate spiritual disciplines of prayer, scripture, can start right there and build.
Well, I remember a gentleman, we had a motor vehicle accident. I was called in on a Sunday morning, and there was a death in the accident. And during that time, when the father arrived, and I was escorting him to our quiet room, he became very angry with me. And he used a few expletives with me and just said, you better not tell me my son is dead. That's not my function to tell somebody. That is up to a doctor to tell them. But as we were approaching the quiet room, his wife came out of the room and he immediately shook her because she already knew that the son was dead. He had made a motion that he was going to, in a sense, deck me, but he didn't. He called me a few names, and he basically had told me he did not want me there. But the wife said, no, I want you here. I want to know that God didn't do this. And yet the husband or the father was very angry at God. I stayed. I didn't say anything, but I stayed. Several months later, this gentleman came into my office. He started off with, you probably don't remember me, and I remembered him. I even called him by name, and he looked at me and said, I called you a few names which I really came to apologize.
Wow.
Because I was those expletives. And I just looked at him, I said, no, you were a grieving father. With that, he started crying, and we took about 2 hours and sat and talked about what he experienced that day.
Yeah.
So just being there, regardless. And I always think back to that, because there comes a time, sometimes as chaplains, I've come to points where I think, I'd love to get out of here. This is getting pretty tense for me. And I don't know how I can handle it, but yet I find that strength from my Lord to get me through this. And having a gentleman like this who later comes back, and like you had said, the nurse who told you later of how much it meant for you to be there, it does bring God into the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you're involved in the debriefing or in the process of trying to, as you put it in perspective, that's a role that probably nobody else can do as well as any one of you could, because you really do have the alpha and the omega. You've got the beginning and the end in mind, and many times other people don't. I think the other thing, I just wanted to add this, is that probably medical people don't realize how important your role can be and don't maximize it. And I don't think that's because they don't know about it. I think it's because they just haven't been acquainted with it enough to understand it from that perspective. But, that's something I think that is changing, and based on what we're hearing is becoming more important, particularly because of people like you who are bringing this forward. And I think families, too, are probably demanding it. Now, Gib, you probably see this also outside of the healthcare setting, where people, after an accident, are dealing with things months later or
Right.
years later.
Right.
How does that work?
There's usually a period of time where you have most influence. At church, we have what's called Stephen ministers, which are one-on-one caregiving, and usually we try to connect people up with that. Sometimes people need professional counseling. We'll refer them onto that, just depending. Some people are in a small group. That's enough to enable them to be able to continue healing and be able to walk that out. So we kind of leave it up to them, watch them, see them, just depending on what their needs are.
Yeah. Yeah, because you have a chance to see whether they're going to recover from this incident completely or not.
Right.
Which many times, when they
Right.
leave the hospital,
Right.
nobody really knows.
Right. Well, there is no normal after that. There's a new normal.
Oh.
It's a new life. It's a new. It's.
I understand that. Yeah.
Things radically change.
Yeah. And that new normal, I think, is something that, for somebody who doesn't have a spiritual foundation or understanding, probably feels like, as you had said, they're being picked on by somebody, or they're being unfairly treated by life. Now, Kathy, I think you had said something about how important it is to be involved with the staff, to educate them, and I think that's one of the things that you try to do all the time, right?
Yes. As the Director of Pastoral Care, when I first came to Covenant, chaplains were thought of as purely and solely the God Squad, for lack of a better term.
Oh, okay.
So if a patient needed someone to listen and was struggling, if they listed no particular religion or faith tradition, sometimes the nurses wouldn't connect us with that patient. So I think over the 5 years that I've been there, a lot of the education is that someone's spirituality may include the divine, and it may be more than that. And a great example I love to use, related to what you were talking about in terms of hope and the rehab process, sometimes, for example, a patient's grandchildren are part of their spirituality. They may have a faith in God, and that is helping them through the recovery process, but when I listen to them, they'll say things like, I need to get on track with what the doctor's saying so that I can play with my grandchildren. And here's a picture of them, and let me point them out to you. And then more later on in the conversation, I need to do those exercises they want me to do in rehab so I can go back to playing with my grandchildren. So I think spirituality, certainly for those that are from a religious background, includes God, but spirituality and hope for the future and the new normal also includes other things near and dear, like family or being outdoors in nature and one with creation, things like that.
Okay. As we have a few minutes left, what kind of a takeaway would you like to have people hear from you with regards to this whole idea of faith healing? And why don't we start over here with Gib on the
Oh
end.
man, start with me. Okay. The one takeaway, trust God. Just believe that God is there, that He will walk them through. Jesus, one of the things He claimed when He started His ministry, set captives free, to heal people, And he's constantly doing that through whatever life experiences people go through.
Okay.
So it's he's there.
God is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Roger, takeaway?
I would say that when a chaplain comes into a room, it's not necessarily because the person is dying or dead. It's a matter of we're there to be of support. We're there to convey a God who cares and does love them, and to continue that care.
Okay. Kathy?
I would say to families and patients in the recovery process to not keep things in, to share either with a religious leader or a close friend or family the multitude of emotions that must be going through, and it's all okay, but to find that support to share what's on your heart.
Tim?
I'm impressed with a number of people who had a church connection and have gotten away from that for one reason or another. And they say, well, I haven't gone to church or whatever for a long time, but when they get into that experience, those things, those feelings come around again. And it doesn't matter if you've been to church recently. It doesn't matter if you can be there and in your experience with God, regardless of your circumstances, regardless of whether you've been in church lately, whether you haven't. At any time, God is there for you.
Okay. I guess the takeaway I want the audience to have is, life's a journey. Along the way, you may end up with a crash. You may end up with something traumatic. There may be something that takes you away from the normal, and as Gib had described it, creates a new normal. There are people, dedicated, passionate, caring people, who work in healthcare, who work in the communities, that provide what would probably be described as a special kind of spiritual service that we probably wouldn't consider until times like this. What I think that people need to realize too is that you can also be part of that spiritual care. You can support these kinds of people as they're doing their work, and if you feel that there's something you can do to add to what is already being done. For instance, if you know somebody in your community that's had a tragedy, maybe there's a way that you can add something of your own, supporting what they're doing, and also working with them. Maybe even asking them from time to time, hey, is there anything I can do to help you? I have an interest in volunteering, or I have an interest in just providing some kind of support. How could you use me? I think in that respect, we could build a stronger support network, particularly for people who are in these very, very trying experiences, such as in a motor vehicle accident or other traumatic events. So thank you all, and I hope you appreciate this series, and in particular this program, Faith Healing. Take care.